So, in my second speech, I'm going to talk about something that is very old, 806 years old this year, 2021, in fact. And yet, it is still topical and relevant, still creating headlines around the world and passionate debates in legal circles. The Magna Carta. It was signed in a field next to the River Thames at Runnymede, near Windsor in England. And I always had a sort of attachment to it ever since I was little, as at school we all had to memorize the date of the Magna Carta, the date it was signed. And that's about all I could remember about it until very recently. 12th of June, 1215 was the date. Then, of course, there's the vague idea that we all have that it's about democracy and freedom, that sort of thing. But anyone involved with law, government, politics, or human rights will tell you that the Magna Carta gave us some of the most fundamental principles underpinning free societies. I'm going to discuss some of those later, but first of all, let me tell you why it's been in the headlines. The Magna Carta has been on a whistle-stop tour of the world. The tour is taking the ancient document, one of 4 originals, to 8 countries on 4 continents. As part of that tour, one of the 4 originals was displayed in Luxembourg at the European Court of Justice to honor its legal significance. I was lucky enough to go and see it. It was possibly the smallest exhibition I've ever attended. Just one glass case containing 2 small sheets of paper, each covered in small spidery handwriting that I could hardly decipher. But the sight of those 2 small objects made my hair stand on end. Here was something 806 years old, which is still regarded as a cornerstone of the British Constitution and of the rights of man around the world. Let's just look at some of the descriptions of the Magna Carta that you can find, descriptions by experts and academics. It contains fundamental values that challenge the autocracy of the king. It's a potent international rallying cry against the arbitrary use of power. It's the greatest constitutional document of all time, and it's the foundation of freedom. Well, potent claims for that small sheet of paper, but all this hyperbole, how can it be relevant 800 or so years later? Especially in a country, the UK, which I had always thought set little store by written constitutions. Well, perhaps I can leave the question hanging while I get back to the Magna Carta and its world tour. While catching up with the news after my trip to Luxembourg, I saw this newspaper headline: China refuses to display the Magna Carta at a university exhibition. Sure enough, just after its brief stopover in Luxembourg, the Magna Carta had been whisked off to China for the next stage of its tour. It seems to have caused an unexpected diplomatic kerfuffle, with the Chinese authorities denying permission for it to be displayed at Renmin University, Beijing. The constitutional significance of the Magna Carta ruffled feathers, apparently because of the rise of a progressive movement known as Constitutionalism. And Britain didn't want any ruffled feathers just before an official visit to Britain by President Xi Jinping. So the ancient manuscript had to be bundled into the British embassy in rather a hurry. As a result, that tiny piece of paper I had peered at just a few days ago actually almost caused an international incident. So then, the Magna Carta still has the power to influence, to stir debate and controversy. But why exactly is that? I'd like to look now at some of the main principles or provisions of the Charter. The most important one has to be the 39th clause, which states that all free men had a right to justice and a fair trial. These are very familiar to us and have been enshrined in many constitutional documents around the world: the United States Bill of Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the European Convention on Human Rights. They all include this principle. Secondly, everybody, including the king, is subject to the law. Well, Certainly an aspiration to what we now think of as the rule of law, isn't it? So, the end of the autocratic power then? Not even close. Through many amendments, repeals, and long-standing tussles with Rome, most of the provisions limiting the power of the crown were scrapped. But by 1225, with a more permanent version of the Magna Carta in place, the monarchy did accept the need to gain support from the aristocracy, and much later, Parliament, in order to raise taxes. Thirdly, the third clause of the Charter states that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. In other words, no unlawful detention. This, again, has all been hedged about by various restrictions over the centuries. It has been flouted and abused by unscrupulous leaders, but the simple principles echo down the centuries as an inspiration for legislators and politicians. Fourthly, no taxes could be demanded without the general consent of the realm meaning the leading barons and churchmen of the day. Fifthly, and lastly, fines were linked to the severity of an offense. So, some of this remains current and is the subject of lively debate and passionate reinterpretation by jurists. But some of our historical memory about the Magna Carta is very misleading. For example, there's a common perception that the Magna Carta created what we call habeas corpus. Now, habeas corpus, literally translated from Latin, means you should have the body. This means that an individual can call on a court to produce a person who has been detained, and the court can then decide whether they have been detained lawfully. So, isn't that the same as unlawful detention? Well, it's closely linked, but the difference is that habeas corpus is actually a procedure known as writ. A writ is an order to the queen or king or governor to produce a prisoner so they can be seen and heard and for the law to prevail. The Magna Carta was concerned with the need for a person to have a trial, yes, but habeas corpus deals with the possibility of a prisoner being held incommunicado, for example. Producing the prisoner does not, in English law at least, mean that they must be tried. So that is one conception, which is wrong. The strong popular belief that habeas corpus came from the Magna Carta stems in part from political and constitutional developments in England in the 17th century. Those who wanted to give the English Parliament more power were looking for convincing arguments that Englishmen deserved better representation under a parliamentary system. They advocated reviving principles from the Magna Carta, which was already 400 years old then, as the Charter was then thought to have brought back personal freedoms. And these personal freedoms initially formed part of an ancient English constitution in Anglo-Saxon times, according to these 17th century jurists. This argument is really based on nostalgic fantasy than hard facts, but the link is there to stay in many minds. The other mix-up about the Magna Carta is the rather grandiose assertion that the Magna Carta was a foundation of democracy. That's certainly not true, because the references to free man in the Magna Carta, which may have given rise to this impression, were few and far between at that time. So, a fair trial was fair if you were born a baron, but not if you were a serf, which by far the majority of the population were. In fact, the barons were concerned with fair trial because they were the most likely ones to be imprisoned for trying to overthrow King John. They were not trying to strike a blow for the likes of you or me. The fact is that the group of 25 barons had organized a rebellion. The crown granted the barons the use of extensive land. In return, they had to pay taxes and perform military service. That's nothing new, but John's military campaigns had been draining, and the taxes were extortionate. The barons had taken London already and threatened to plunge England into a civil war. John signed the deal to save his skin and the power of his monarchy, not to create a democratic society with the sort of rights and privileges we talk about today. There have been innumerable developments to our law and constitution since then, and there's no more time to go into detail on that. But one interesting aspect of the Magna Carta is the way it is viewed around the world and its significance in other countries. In the US, for example, people seem to confirm greater prestige on the Magna Carta than it is done in Britain. Coming back to Runnymede, the place where it all began, I always wondered why it was the Americans who erected the monument to the Magna Carta there. I assumed it was because they had more money. But it seems that the prestige of the Magna Carta there stems from the fact that early colonists to America held the Magna Carta to be fundamental law. Something, in other words, that is above both king and parliament and unalterable by statute. In the early 18th century, this interpretation led to greater respect for constitutional rule and an inclination towards written constitutions rather than the trend towards parliamentary sovereignty, which was happening on this side of the Atlantic. The Magna Carta, then, either way, remains strong in our memories. Why is that really? Reflecting now on all those different points, factual and less factuals, well, I would say it's because it represents a combination of essential limitations to autocratic power. Then there's the backdrop of the struggle with Rome, something that has run through English history ever since anyone can remember. The Magna Carta enshrines the freedom of the Church of England, possibly paving the way for the more dramatic stance taken by much more famous monarchs later on. Then there's the everlasting drama of royal power and succession in England. Always a good story. Personally, I like to see in the Magna Carta the human endeavor to overcome unfairness and exploitation. All that on a small, dog-eared, ink-stained piece of paper. Thank you.